Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. It's actually the last episode for the year. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a senior fellow, non-resident, at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today, we're going to talk about the state of play of the trade relations between the US and the European Union. And we have two guests from business here. I'm very happy to welcome Marjorie Chorlins, who is Senior Vice President, Europe for the US Chamber of Commerce, and Luisa Santos, who is Deputy Director General at Business Europe in Brussels. You're both very welcome. The United States and the European Union are close partners. They trade goods and services with each other at a value of $1.3 trillion a year. That is almost the same in euros. The transatlantic economy supports at least 16 million jobs, but strangely enough, there is no trade agreement. We tried hard, and for full disclosure, I was very much involved, and so was Marjorie and Luisa, a couple of years ago when we tried to negotiate the so-called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. But as from late 2016, that agreement, which is maybe two-thirds made, is in the freezer and is not likely to get defrosted soon, at least not in that form. Since May 2021, we have something called Trade and Technology Council, which is a forum with regular meetings between ministers and principals, but also with 10 working groups where civil servants from both sides meet regularly to discuss issues such as semiconductors, WTO, standards, and to coordinate different approaches to global trade and investment. There has been some cooperation decided on semiconductors, on some standards, on electric charges, etc. But the general point of view is that it is under-delivering. It could do more. But of course, it is important to have a forum. Now, next year is approaching and we're entering election year. There are many elections around the world. There's a presidential election in the United States. It will be important for America, but also for the rest of the world. In Europe, there is elections to the European Parliament. And after that, there will be new or possibly reappointed leaders, head of the Commission, the European Council, the High Representative. So what can we expect to happen the remaining year? As elections are coming, that might lead to changes, and what would be the ideal outcome from the business point of view? This is what we're going to discuss today. So let's start with the Trade and Technology Council, sometimes called TTC. Marjorie, from the US business perspective, what's your view? Is it useful? Could it do more? And if yes, what?
First off, Cecilia, thanks so much to you and to PIIE for inviting for me and for the Chamber to participate this morning. It's always a great opportunity to chat with Luisa. We share many of the same views reflective of the shared perspectives of business on both sides of the Atlantic. And so, and it's great to see you as well. So thank you. Look, the Trade and Technology Council is, I'm glad we have it. Since we don't have really any other formal mechanism for talking about coordination and collaboration on critical issues. It is, as you say, it has under-delivered in terms of its ambition. And I don't have any expectation that there's suddenly going to be this blossoming of a tremendous amount of additional ambition. So what I can hope is that we'll continue to see sort of incremental improvements, that as we have seen on things like expanding the MRA and good manufacturing practices on pharmaceuticals to veterinary products and things like that. Really modest wins like that. I do think we have seen the value of the platform in terms of promoting coordination around the imposition of sanctions against Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine. So there have been wins. There's no question about it. But it is sorely lacking in ambition. And given where we are in the state of the global economy and the challenges that we face in both the US and in Europe, this is the time where we need more ambition, and we need more leadership and more shared engagement on some of these critical issues around things like securing supply chains and challenges from China and so on. The other thing I would say about the TTC from a business perspective is that one of the Chamber and Business Europe have consistently put out statements ahead of each of the ministerials. In fact, we're working on another one now, sort of outlining several priorities. One we keep coming back to is the importance of engaging with stakeholders, as a sort of recognition that it's all well and good to be talking about certain issues and trying to find ways to collaborate. But if you're talking about things that aren't particularly commercially relevant or commercially reasonable, the value of the enterprise is really quite undercut. And so we have consistently sort of hammered on this idea of greater stakeholder engagement. One last thought, and that is that, there are two T's in TTC, right? There's trade and technology. And while there's certainly been work done on things like an AI framework and so on, the technology side, we're not seeing that same ambition on the trade side. And I think that's a real shortcoming.
We'll come back to that. Thank you very much, Marjorie. Luisa, what's the view from the European side?
Thanks, Cecilia, and good afternoon to everyone, and good morning for those in the US. Also very happy to be here. I hope this is not becoming too boring, because of course we will agree on many things together with the Chamber.
Well, it's Christmas.
Yes,
nice.
I know. I totally agree with what Marjorie already said. I think we are happy we're talking, but we need to do more talking. We need to do more than talking, and this is the challenge that we have with the TTC. I mean, the business has always been behind any initiative on the US. You mentioned TTIP was a request from the business. We were strongly supporting together with the US Chamber. The TTC, we were also asking for this because we didn't have any structured platform of formal engagement. So we need it, especially after the bumpy years of the Trump administration. So again, business is backing. The question, you need to keep business engaged if you really want to achieve results. And this is one of the big challenges of this whole exercise, is because we feel that it's not delivering so much in areas that are important for business. You risk losing the attractiveness and the engagement of the business community. And then it means that the exercise in the end will be less positive and produce less results. So it is very important that we keep business engaged. And this means business needs to be consulted at an early stage. And we need to be discussing things that are really important for business. And what are the things that are important for business? How to improve the conditions to do business across the Atlantic. I mean, exactly. Cecilia, you mentioned the amount of trade in goods and services that we have between the EU and US, the amount of investments. But there are a lot of things we can do to make sure that these flows go better, to go faster, more effective, that we reduce the cost for companies, because this in the end will result in more jobs and more investment and more trade between the EU and US. And this is what we need, both our economies need. So we really need to be focusing on these aspects. One clear area where we would like to see more is on clean tech, green goods, green services, green technologies. This is an area where we are developing a lot of solutions right now, both on EU and US. There is strong commitment, political commitment, but also business commitment to do a lot of investments, because we have very high ambition in terms of decarbonizing our economies. I mean, we can help each other because the effort will be big and we could be supporting each other in these efforts. And this is where the TTC should be delivering. And this is definitely one area that business will look very much forward. for, talking about regulatory cooperation, talking about, reducing testing, how can we make life easier for our companies when it comes to standards, when it comes to certification requirements. So all these are areas where we think here we could do more, and we hope we will still be able to do more. We know this U.S. administration is not very keen to discuss market access liberalization, but I think we need to talk about facilitation, at least, of the trade flows. We are not talking about TTIP. We are not talking about a break ground in terms of a new type of free trade agreement, but there are many things that can be done to reduce the obstacles and make sure that we cooperate more. Otherwise, we will continue to talk, and it's very good, and we will continue to develop joint initiatives on areas, for instance, that have to do with foreign policy. But in areas that are really important for business, we will be lacking more and more behind, and there will be less and less business commitment and engagement in the exercise, and this is something we should avoid.
Mm. Already during TTIP time, the mantra was you're either a standard setter or a standard taker. And that is true already today. And there are so many areas, and you mentioned them in the green technology, in the green energy field, where we need to have joint standards because so much is happening right now, and there aren't agreements on this. There is a meeting planned for January. It's been postponed, but a ministerial meeting end of January. I don't think there's a date yet. Do you think there's any chance that there will be something there, or will it have to survive until elections? And would the outcome of the elections, would that change if there is a new president, or if the current president is re-elected? Would he and his administration be braver? Do you want to speculate on that?
What do I think will come out of the January ministerial, assuming there is indeed a January ministerial? I'm not expecting dramatic breakthroughs. I do feel like, first off, I agree with everything Luisa said, of course, in terms of the need for more ambition in very specific areas where we could focus to generate that ambition. I am skeptical about how much forward movement we're going to see. Clearly, there is a desire to focus on things like now they have this Transatlantic initiative on sustainable trade, right? So an effort to sort of take all of the pieces of what's happening in the various working groups on sustainability and as it intersects with trade, and then figure out where the gaps are, and hopefully, fill in some of those gaps. So clearly there's an interest in the topics related to clean technologies, but all we know right now is that there's going to be more talking, and we don't know that there's necessarily going to be concrete agreement on specific measures that will genuinely facilitate that growth in collaboration on clean tech. So I have very modest expectations. I unfortunately my level of expectation for these ministerials has gradually declined over time, and I'm not expecting a tremendous shift in that regard. I hope I'm pleasantly surprised. In terms of what the impacts of the presidential elections will be, it's impossible really to predict. I do think we know what happened under the last administration in terms of its turning away from closer partnership with Europe. I can only imagine that we would see a similar a return to that perspective if Trump is indeed the nominee and we're elected president. None of that is a given. If President Biden is elected to a second term, I think it's an open question about how much more flexibility there will be, because I do believe that there is a philosophy that the president himself carries, a certain philosophy, a certain perspective on trade that is not necessarily the kind of forward-looking, market opening, truly collaborative approach to trade that we would like to see. My colleague John Murphy at the Chamber likes to talk about has talked about the sort of spiral of timidity with this administration when it comes to trade. I'm not sure that we're going to see that spiral necessarily. I'd like to think that the spiral will stop and that we'll start to see a little bit more boldness, but I'm not confident that we'll move away from sort of hefty doses of good old-fashioned protectionism on both sides of the Atlantic.
What do you think, Luisa?
Well, I think we were very hopeful that on some important topics for business, the EU-US summit would have been a bit more conducive.
Exactly.
We have not managed during the whole administration in the US and this commission to solve two of the outstanding conflicts that we had already, and that's steel and aluminium and the aircraft subsidies. So these are still unsolved. We have, in the meantime, of course, still the fallout of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we still are waiting for a critical minerals arrangement that has not materialized either. So, and this was very much what was expected at the summit. So this didn't happen. And now the best we could have was a potential extension of the status quo for the steel and aluminium. So if we were not able to deliver when there was a strong political pressure to achieve something before the summit, we are not expecting, as Marjorie said, that we will see major breakthroughs in the coming months until the elections. And this is the worrying part, is the fact that we are not even capable, and I think this is something that we should, and we have been insisting in all our joint statements, we need to solve these problems. I mean, if we want to go on a better relationship, we need to be able to address these issues. We need to put them aside and start from scratch, and we are not able to do so. And this is something that I think is quite worrying. And we hope that with the new administration, of course, hopefully one that we will be able to talk to and negotiate with, we will be able to come back to these issues and find solutions, because this is also important for keeping the relationship on a stable basis and on a positive basis. We have a lot of other problems around us, and we have a lot of other pressure, also because the geopolitical context is becoming more and more challenging, and this will put additional pressure on the transatlantic relations. So we have a lot of challenges coming up, a lot of potential headwinds. It's important, of course, that the business stays committed and work together as well, because I think we are, at the moment, a very stable, I would say, part of the equation, at least in our joint requests, because that's the way we think we can do the transition from what we have now with this political cycle and to the next political cycle.
Cecilia, if I could just jump on that very quickly to say that I absolutely agree again with Luisa. I think the challenge or the uncertainty that we face is not just related to the election cycle here in the US, but also obviously there are going to be elections in Europe, and it's not,
and in 70 other countries.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's not really clear to me. I don't know that we have a very clear sense of how those election results will affect the sort of philosophy or point of view of the next parliament and the next commission when it comes to things like strategic autonomy and sort of other philosophical frames, if you will, about how to approach global trade and competitiveness. So I think we've got uncertainty on both sides of the Atlantic.
That's certainly so, because we know that the Biden administration has been very unwilling to do any trade agreement where market access or tariff reduction or so on has been included, but also the EU during this time, until very lately, where there has been the agreement with New Zealand and Chile and the push for the Mercosur, but until then, for the last 3-4 years, basically nothing has happened in this regard. But such a thing that would be so simple, the tariffs on steel and aluminium that were imposed by President Trump, with the motivation that imports from Europe and other allies was a threat to national security. And then when President Biden came in, they were transformed, and EU also imposed retaliatory measures. And then they were transformed into quotas, and the EU agreed to suspend the retaliatory measures for quite some time. And there's been negotiations and negotiations. It would seem so simple, but it's not, because you're stuck. But this is also related to a bigger issue related to sustainable steel and carbon leakage, because of course, and that may be an area where you don't necessarily agree, because the US is complaining about the introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that is now gradually entering into force, with partners putting a fee on carbon heavy products such as cement, aluminium, steel, fertilizers, and etc. Whereas the US wants to obtain an agreement on sustainable steel and aluminium, but that is very much an anti-China issue as well, and from a European point of view, not WTO compatible. But the CBAM and the carbon leakage issue is far beyond one simple agreement or disagreement between the US. So how can business push in this area to find some common ground? Luisa, do we have any solutions to this?
Well, the solution would be if everyone accepted the carbon pricing. I think that would be the best solution. But of course, we know this has always been an issue that in the US people are reluctant about, or the majority is reluctant about. So the question is, how are we going to create a system that is still equivalent in a way and does not create unnecessary burden between our two economies? So that's one point. The second point is, of course, one thing is carbon leakage, the other thing is overcapacity. And trying to cover both with one instrument, that is the challenge. And I think that's what the US is trying to do with the proposal on the general agreement on sustainable steel and aluminium. So we have these two challenges, different approaches on how you deal with decarbonization and how you price carbon. And the second one is that we tend to see this issue of decarbonization and the issue of overcapacity as different, while the US wants to put it, or this US administration wants to cover it both. Plus, the EU has already a mechanism. So it's very difficult now to come back to something that we are starting to implement. So we are still in a transition phase. We are not yet charging the tariff, but we will. But it is already in place. I mean, we have already collection of information. So you cannot come back to something that already exists. And the US wants us to commit to something that could potentially put in question what we have. So this is a very difficult equation to do. I think we need to separate the two topics, the decarbonization or carbon leakage and the question of overcapacity. And we need to work on overcapacity. We need to define rules on this among ourselves. We were discussing at one point, and you remember that very well, Cecilia, with Japan, on trying to find rules on say state subsidies, especially in the industrial goods. This now has become even more urgent because everyone is subsidizing. So we need to admit that we're all subsidizing one way or the other, but we need to find disciplines. And I think we can, of course, it will be very difficult to have China buying in, and we know the major problem is on China. But we need to set the example, at least between us, and try to find a solution that is based on rules, but trying to understand as well that we might not have common approaches on how to deal with the problem. We need to accept that we want the same objective, but our approaches might be different. And the same goes for the carbon leakage. And I think the problem is this one. We have different approaches, we don't accept it, and we try to impose on each other the other approaches. And if we do this, we will never find a solution. And I think this is we will continue to postpone the issue. And that I think is very bad, because it leaves the economic operators with a lot of uncertainty.
Well, and that idea.
How do you square that circle, Marjorie?
Yeah, I think that idea of, each trying to oppose the other's view, the approach on one another, that was, of course, the stake in the heart of the TTIP negotiations as well, right? So, look, I think that our view has the notion that imports of European steel and aluminum somehow threaten U.S. national security, to us has always seemed a silly proposition. And it's, there's a hefty dose of good old-fashioned protectionism underlying that move. I also agree that the idea of trying to carve out an agreement that addresses it tries to achieve two very different objectives in terms of responding to global overcapacity on the one hand, and also reducing emissions on the other, is a real challenge. So it's not at all surprising to me that there is this implicit, or maybe now explicit, agreement to sort of kick the can down the road even further, past the elections. Again, a reflection of the fact that much of this is sort of politically motivated, right? So I do think there's always been the original imposition of the tariffs, and then by the counterbalancing measures, was always misguided. And I'm not sure we're on a path to resolving the fundamental issues. On the question of the CBAM, yes, it's true, it's there. We're now in the reporting phase. And we won't get to sort of the true implementation for another couple of years. I'd like to think there may be room for tweaks along the way, in part because some of what's there is not particularly clear. And for example, this notion of, well, maybe there may be a way to sort of to measure equivalence of comparable schemes in other countries. We don't even know what that might look like, right? So there's a lack of definition there. There's companies aren't sure in terms of even reporting about direct emissions, the information they need to collect from their supply chain. So they're hoping, for example, to be able to rely on default values, but those default values haven't been defined either. So I think the challenge we have with the CBAM, yes, there is a I think there's a very legitimate notion of attaching a price to carbon. But I think part of the challenge we have with CBAM is that there was a big push to get this done very quickly. And there are a lot of things that are yet to be defined. That kind of uncertainty and lack of clarity is exactly the thing that leaves business in a really parlous state, right? Because if we don't really know the standards that we're supposed to be achieving, or the definitions, it's impossible to really effectively comply.
And would there be any realism in imagining some kind of carbon pricing mechanism in the US? It has been discussed in the House,
yes.
but there doesn't seem to be any majority for that right now.
No, look, I think I'm not an expert when it comes to issues related to carbon pricing. My impression is that there is a growing recognition of the need to be able to put a price on carbon. What the mechanism looks like to do that, I think, is very much open to question. Now, maybe there isn't even agreement on the core premise, but from our perspective anyway, that is something we have to figure out. And the question is, how do you do that in a way that again achieves the fundamental objectives of trying to reduce emissions, but doing so in a way that is not sort of does fundamental harm to competitiveness and innovation, and sort of the the essence of business, which is the driver of economic growth.
Luisa, you mentioned subsidies, and this has been very much discussed lately, both in the US and in Europe, but also around the world. It seems to be like we have a subsidy spiral coming up, and the US and Europe used to be, very, very critical vis-a-vis China and others for these subsidies. Now, not all subsidies are bad. Some can, when the market is not functioning, and we talk about the climate transition and energy transition, they could be justified, but nobody really knows what is justified and what is not. And the risk is, of course, that companies and countries hurt each other with this spiral of subsidies. Would this not be an area? I mean, we have some basic agreement in the WTO. There's an old regulation on subsidies and countervailing measures, but would this not be an area where the EU and the US could sit together to see where we can find some sort of complementarity and do no harm to each other, but defining what is a good or bad subsidy? Is this something that the business community could figure participating in?
Look, I think this discussion started already in the context of the discussions around the Inflation Reduction Act. Because there was a track created precisely to discuss clean tech subsidies, but I think we need to go beyond that. I mean, we know that there was a very strong reaction in Europe to the Inflation Reduction Act, also because, of course, as we always say, the US put a very big carrot in front of the business, while the EU had a very big stick behind the business and trying to make sure that business follows certain rules. So we had very different approaches, and of course then there was definitely a concern that the US would attract investments that then would leave Europe, because of course we have other problems of high energy costs and the high regulatory burden that is also impacting costs in Europe. So I think we need to go beyond that. I think we need to have a much more open discussion, because the situation has changed in the sense that we do understand, and in Europe we're also discussing now what subsidies we have and what kind of subsidies we should have. And there is an ongoing discussion, of course, because we also know that some member states have more fiscal capacity and they can subsidize more their own industries. And this is something that, of course, also impacts the functioning of the internal market, and is something that worries the business community. But within this new context, where indeed a lot of us are subsidizing, I think we need to define some clear ideas and clear principles on, transparency, non-discrimination. What are the areas where, you really reserve your right to have a space where you might even use exceptions in the area of environment or others to support your industry. I think we need to have this adult conversation beyond the problems we had in the past. And this, I don't think people are there yet. The idea, as you said, Cecilia, I totally agree, is that we don't see each other as competitors. Of course, we are competitors. Companies are competing all over the world, huh? We are competing within the single market. So, of course, we are competing with the US. But I think we need to see beyond that competition, and not see that we are going to win and the other is going to lose. So the idea is that we both win. And of course, this will be companies doing better than others, but that we don't start just seeing a competition between us, who can attract more investments and who can do more jobs. Because I think that is the issue, and has been the issue in the discussions around subsidies, and we need to go beyond that. We need to admit that they are there, they're reality. Of course, we have rules in Europe that have been flexibilized lately, but we need to be able to discuss also, especially with the US, what kind of rules do we need, at least to agree on some principles that should govern our bilateral relations when it comes to this area.
What's your view on that, Marjorie? The change in the views of subsidies from the US side?
Well, it's interesting because, Luisa mentioned a little while ago the dispute over large civil aircraft. And that was all about subsidies. It is all about subsidies. It continues to be
20-year-old dispute,
right?
yes.
So this notion of, what kind of subsidies are acceptable and what aren't, at least in terms of what's consistent with the WTO rules, is not a new conversation. I think the issue is that we are now, in particular, with the green transition, very focused on how to achieve that transition in the most competitive way. And so, of course, there is greater emphasis on the conversation about subsidies now. And to the extent we're able to have a shared agreement about the value of, about the utility of a shared perspective on what constitutes, good subsidies, if you will, I do think there is some merit to that. The challenge, I think, is a broader one, though. I think there is a broader issue related to how both the US and Europe perceive competitiveness, relatively speaking. Yes, there was a tremendous amount of concern and great outcry in Europe over the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act here. But after you got past all of the sort of hue and cry about the measure itself, the next message that was, I think, has become very prominent in Europe is around whether or not Europe is sufficiently competitive. And whether, as a result of the subsidies embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act, Europe is going to lose out, right? So there is this, I think, almost sort of reflexive view that we need to throw more money at industries in order to ensure our competitiveness. And I think that subsidy race is really has the potential to be very detrimental. So I think the fundamental question is, how do you promote competitiveness in your economy? What is the right balance of carrots and sticks? And it is certainly the case, as Luisa said, there seems to be more emphasis on carrots on this side and more emphasis on sticks in Europe. And I think Europe is needing to sort of wrestle with how to strike a more robust balance. I'm not suggesting the US doesn't as well, but I think figuring out, even within the context of the European Union, what is that right balance, right? What is the right level of regulatory burden that you are going to impose on industry, even as you're trying to promote these transitions, and what are you going to do to encourage them to facilitate that transition? I think is a very complicated question, and I'm not sure Europe has really collectively wrapped its brain around what that needs to look like.
Can I pick on that? I think I totally agree, Marjorie. I think we are still in the middle of that discussion in Europe as well, on what tools can we use to be more competitive, and discussing what are the weaknesses that we have. But I do think that we have one area where we can work together, and that is we have very integrated supply chains.
Yes.
We want them to continue to be integrated and resilient. And if we are not careful, if we end up in a situation where we are fighting each other and competing against each other, we will be breaking down those supply chains and in the end favoring others. And this is something we should avoid. Sorry, I need water.
Approaching the end of the
year. It chokes you up.
Talking for months.
Go ahead.
Okay, Luisa? No, I just wanted to but there's also the aspect of third countries here. China, I mean, US and Europe have for ages trying to push on China and criticize them for subsidizing, which they do, obviously, but the credibility vis-a-vis China, if EU and Europe and the US cannot agree on common definitions and a common sort of discipline, within that is also, of course, something that can be very difficult for discussions within the WTO, but also in direct conversations with China.
Precisely, that's a bit what I was saying. I mean, I think we need to. We are competitors, and this is normal, but we need to have a more cooperative approach in certain areas. And for sure, this is one where I think we need to pass the problems and try to have a more flexible approach. I'm not saying we're going to define the rules, but at least a set of principles that we should agree and we start implementing between us. This could be the basis also for discussion with others. We were discussing at one point with Japan. I think others would be interested also in joining this conversation. Because otherwise, I think otherwise China can also say, well, you criticize me, but in the end, you're doing like I do.
Right.
And we don't really have any arguments against this in the end. No?
One area that is also related to the Inflation Reduction Act is that there is if EU and US had a trade agreement, a lot of things would have been easier in the Inflation Reduction Act. But there is an attempt, and you alluded quickly to that, Luisa, to negotiate a kind of mini trade agreement on critical minerals between the EU and the US. US has one of these with Japan, and there are also talks ongoing with Indonesia and others to see if Europe would have access to some of the tax credits if there are agreements on recycled batteries and some minerals, etc. This has also been stuck. It should be a very easy process, but it's not, because there are lots of other things coming into that process. But the fact is, of course, that the need for critical minerals, both from the EU side and Europe and US side, is going to grow tremendously, and we don't have those minerals on our continents. So the dependence from China and others is very big, and this is very much into the de-risking that both Europe and US is talking about here. Wouldn't this be an area where much more could be done to cooperate, to diversify, to help investing in maybe third countries, and to see how you could secure the supply chains when it comes to critical minerals?
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that. I guess I would say that on the issue of, you mentioned we don't have the minerals. I would argue we probably do. In fact, I think we do. It's a question of whether we can actually get them out of the ground, right?
We have them in Europe as well, but they're very far down.
Right. I mean, when we were at the TTC ministerial in Luleå, we were told about the deposits in the far northern part of the country, and it's a question of, can you get to that, and that speaks to a much larger problem we have, I think, both in the US and Europe when it comes to things like permitting reform and so on. Look, I think as far as the critical minerals agreement, I mean, we're following along what's happening. It's not really clear to me what that agreement would do. It isn't, I mean, European EVs are already entering the US market, and they are benefiting from the tax credits. I mean, it's largely through the leasing exception.
The leasing,
but the fact is they are coming in. And the battery technologies are evolving so rapidly. It's not really clear to me how this whole debate will play out. I mean, I don't know that we'll look back on this and necessarily think that this was sort of a tempest in a teapot by any means. But I think that what it is we're trying to achieve here is a little bit unclear to me for the, as you look off onto the horizon.
I think, I think initially the idea was, of course, a more political one. I think more than the economic meaning of this whole exercise, we have the political one. And the political, because, well, it's a recognition that the US is considering Europe as a strategic partner. in an area that is very important for, well, what in Europe now everyone is talking about, economic security, but it's a strategic asset, especially for the green and digital transition. So the fact that you have this with Japan and Europe, I mean, it means that you're actually in one key area, you are agreeing with an important partner, that you want to follow certain principles when it comes to raw materials and critical minerals. And I think this is beyond the market access. So it was more the political angle and than the economic. We don't agree even on that. I think also because there are some in the US Congress that were not so happy with what was agreed with Japan, and they don't want to see a repetition in the agreement with Europe. And this is probably pushing as well the US administration to be a bit more demanding and try to be a bit more specific on some points. But can we do something here together? This is the question, because we both have the same challenge, as you were saying, Cecilia. Can we once again work together? Because there's a lot of good statements coming also from G7 that we should work together on economic security, that we need to work together, you know, on providing access to critical raw materials, that we should take into consideration the resilience of our supply chains. The question is, are we going to transform some of these political commitments into something that is more concrete? And this is the more challenging part, and we are not able yet to do it. Can we do something at G7 level? And because I think we all want the same objective, reduce or mitigate risk. We want to increase our sources of supply. We want also to increase the processing capacity outside China, because I think everyone knows there is a lot of concentration here in China from everywhere around the world. So we need to create. So can we do something together to facilitate this exercise? And this is something I think would make sense for us to work together. But again, I think we will probably have different objectives. And therefore, we don't, when we say we, not necessarily the business, but the administrations, and that's why we don't achieve the same goal. So what is the objective? Is to increase resilience of our supply chains, is to mitigate risk, or is there any other objective? That is more important. And I think we come back to the same problem of the steel and aluminium. Is probably some are trying to address many objectives with one tool and this is not compatible in the end, and we are stuck. And I hope we go beyond this.
There are some questions from the audience. I will get them into you. One is about the recently provisional agreement on corporate sustainability and due diligence. It was an agreement accepted this week. And your views, if you have had time to look at it, is very recent. How will business comply? And do you have concerns about legislation, whether implementation costs, litigation, and coverage? This is something where the EU and the US have been running a little bit parallel tracks, but there's also cooperation on the, for instance, forced labor in Shenyang, in China. Do you have any views on that?
Well, from our perspective, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, is very much top of mind for our member companies. It's been extraordinary to watch the number of companies that have sort of become more aware of not only what is anticipated, but what are the potential implications of it. Again, as with some of the other regulatory measures that come out of Europe, I think that there are laudable objectives, and at the same time there is a question about whether, in trying to achieve those objectives, you are creating more obstacles and burdens that will fundamentally undermine what it is you're trying to achieve, right? So you want greater transparency in supply chains. You want to ensure that as companies are doing business globally, they are striving to achieve certain objectives around environment, sustainability, labor rights, human rights, and so on. The problem is that if you layer all of these obligations on top of companies in terms of reporting objective requirements and so on top of existing reporting requirements that may already be there for some sectors, you're creating a burden that is in some cases almost impossible for companies to comply with, especially true for small and medium-sized companies. So there are real questions in our mind, real challenges associated with the CSDDD. And in fact, the Chamber recently put out a report on the subject that speaks to many of these concerns. But I think it's reflective of sort of the larger challenge that we see, especially in Europe, so some in the US, but especially in Europe, right? The wanting to be a global, the regulator to the world on the one hand, but having to balance that against, how do you make sure that your companies are still competitive? And I think that is a tension that hasn't been fully resolved in Europe right now. We see that obviously in the digital sphere, which we can also talk about, where I think Europe has really overreached in terms of the measures that it's seeking to impose, and as a result risks hindering its own technological competitiveness as a result. To the extent folks are more focused on things like sovereignty and regulation than they are on things like competitiveness, or in the case, say, of the EUCS, for example, in terms of cybersecurity, right? Even European firms are talking about the downsides of that proposed measure. So I think there is a fundamental challenge, a tension between the broad objectives that some folks are trying to achieve with these measures. Many of those objectives are laudable. The question is, how does that actually function in reality? What are the burdens you're placing on business? These aren't US company concerns uniquely. European companies share these concerns as well, right? Because if you continue to apply those, impose those burdens that are, that aren't necessarily going to achieve the desired objective, companies are going to be less inclined to do business in the market where those rules are being applied.
Luisa, you don't have to defend the Commission on all this. It's a general problem.
No,
and also the AI Act, which is the first attempt to regulate something globally. And how do you balance regulation, which is needed, with innovation? That is also a hard matter.
That is definitely one of the big challenges we have. And we've been as Business Europe for some time, drawing the attention to the fact that we need to be careful with the regulations. Is the pure amount of regulations and the fact that in many cases these regulations are quite broad and they need to be implemented and they need to work in practice, and in some cases this is far from clear. So regulating through regulating is not ensuring that we will have decarbonization or digitalization, and is definitely will not ensure us that we have a growth model that will allow us to remain competitive. So we need to couple the regulation with other measures, and we need to make sure that the regulation works. Now, on the Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive, we've been, as Business Europe, very active since the start in the file. We have been fighting to make sure that the file achieves in the end a product or a legislation that is implementable.
Exactly.
I would not want to make too many comments on the compromise that was reached, because it was still a political compromise. We still need to see it in concrete terms, but it is very clear that it will have a strong impact. This legislation, together with others, it will have a strong impact on our supply chains. and it will have a strong impact on our trading partners. And we see already a lot of problems, for instance, with the deforestation regulation, because a lot of our trading partners are complaining and saying that we are becoming regulatory imperialists, and this is also harming our image. So we need to make sure that all these regulations, also for the image of Europe in the world and the weight of Europe, this commission says wants to be a geopolitical actor, that these are not undermining also Europe and Europe's image in the world, because we need to make sure that this is also implementable, not only for European companies and American companies that invest in Europe, but also for our trading partners, especially in developing countries.
Well, we're approaching the end, but just one final question. In January, there will be the TTC ministerial, and then a month later, there will be the ministerial of the WTO, the MC13. And I know that both of your organizations are very supportive of WTO and the multilateral system, but there's no secret that WTO is in deep crisis, of course, and whether even if the world right now is in deep need of sort of global regulations and cooperation, that does not really work. Do you have any wishes for the WTO ministerial now that we are approaching writing the lists for Santa? Anything you think actually could happen in Dubai?
Well, at least that we don't end up in a total collapse, and a total collapse would be that we do not have, for instance, the extension of the moratorium on electronic transmissions, and we will also not like to have a further extension of the waiver on intellectual property to diagnosis and therapeutics, because we think the emergency situation that we lived during COVID is ended, is over. And we definitely need to see a solution for the dispute settlement. We need a binding dispute settlement. Now, how we achieve it, we can discuss, but this is urgent.
I absolutely agree with Luisa. I think that, the chamber certainly will be there. We are expecting at best modest outcomes, like Luisa. We don't want to see the expansion of the TRIPS waiver. From what I understand, the COVID waiver that was adopted actually has never been used. So it really begs the question, why would you go ahead and expand this to something when the original one hasn't been used? Yes, on the e-commerce moratorium, the notion of extending it for now is sending, I think, exactly the wrong signal. And on dispute settlement, absolutely agree. There is need for reform, and we need a process that is, expeditious, that's thoughtful, that's transparent, and that responds to some of the legitimate concerns that I think it's not just the U.S., but that have been shared about how that dispute settlement process has worked over the years. So modest expectations. I hope that the WTO will remain relevant. It gets harder and harder for that institution to do so if we don't tackle some of these issues in a pretty straightforward way and do so expeditiously.
Well, indeed, and it is weak and struggling, but it's the best we have. So hopefully, ministers will find ways to take care of it and develop it. But indeed, expectations are very low. Let's just hope that at least it doesn't go backwards. Marjorie Chorlins from US Chamber of Commerce, Luisa Santos from Business Europe in Brussels. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you to all of you who have been listening, and I wish you the happy holidays and all the best for the new year. Take care.
Thanks, Cecilia. Take care.
Thank you, Cecilia. Bye-bye. All the best. Bye, Marjorie.